Greetings everyone, welcome back to the channel. So one of the most interesting and widely misunderstood facts about temporary insanity is that it doesn't actually need to be diagnosed as a mental illness at all. Unlike long-term mental health conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder that are often supported by a paper trail of treatment history, a temporary insanity defense can hinge entirely on the defendant's mental state at the precise moment of the crime, even if they were mentally sound both before and after. When you enter a normal insanity plea, you can usually rely on your documented history of mental illness as evidence to support your defense. But with a temporary insanity plea, you don't have any documentation to present as evidence, and you just have to convince a judge or a jury that you were in a temporary state of mania at the time of the incident. That means that someone can, theoretically, be perfectly sane by clinical standards, but still be found to be legally insane due to an extreme psychotic break. And what's interesting is that the success rate for any insanity defense, whether it's temporary or not, is shockingly low. In the US, the insanity plea is raised in less than 1% of felony cases. And of those, only about 25% are successful. So when you narrow it down to temporary insanity specifically, the odds are even worse. Likely under 1 in 500 cases, depending on, how strictly you define it and the jurisdiction. And even in the rare instances where the insanity plea does work, it's usually not just like a get out of jail free card. Defendants who are found not guilty by reason of insanity, whether it's temporary or chronic, are almost always committed to a mental institution, and sometimes for longer than the prison sentence would have been in the first place. And in some states, there's no cap on how long they can even be held. So needless to say, you can't just invoke a temporary insanity defense lightly, and there are very serious consequences if it doesn't work out. Even when temporary insanity pleas are successful, the punishment is sometimes worse than what they would have gotten if they had just entered a guilty plea to begin with. But today we're talking about one of those rare instances where I think a temporary insanity plea might actually be successful and completely warranted. So buckle up, because this story is literally insane, Before we jump in, bear in mind that pretty much everything I'm about to say are allegations. Everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and I'm not here to convince you why anyone did anything. We're all entitled to a little bit of speculation based on the facts, though, so let's just jump right in. On the afternoon of May 1st, 2025, officers with the Cincinnati Police Department responded to a report of a stolen vehicle parked at an apartment complex on Warsaw Avenue in the East Prince Hill neighborhood. The vehicle in question was a black Kia SUV, and police, eventually approached the vehicle and they discovered 4 individuals sitting inside. As the officers started moving in, all 4 of the suspects fled on foot, scattering in different directions. One of those suspects was 18-year-old Ryan Hinton. Officers say that during the pursuit, Hinton slipped, dropped a firearm, and then picked it up again before he continued running. And a short time later, a pursuing officer spotted Hinton emerging from between 2 dumpsters in a back alley, and according to police, Hinton was holding the gun in his hand. The officers fired multiple shots, striking Hinton twice. Medical assistance was rendered on the scene and he was transported to the hospital, but unfortunately, he was later pronounced dead. At the site of the shooting, police recovered a semi-automatic handgun with an extended magazine. The entire encounter, from the initial approach all the way up to the use of the deadly force, was captured on body camera footage. And in accordance with department policy, that footage was made available to the family the following day. So on May 2nd, Rodney Hinton Jr., who was Ryan's father, was brought into the station to view the footage. According to the people who were present in the room, Rodney was visibly shaken during the viewing. Apparently he didn't speak much, and at some point during the presentation, he just stood up and walked out of the room. The meeting was cut short, and he left the building in silence. I'll play a clip of the footage that he saw that was later released publicly so that you can get an idea of what happened and where Rodney's head was at after leaving that meeting.
He's got a gun! He's got a gun! On your right! On your right! He's got a gun!
So later that same day, in a different part of the city, a Hamilton County Sheriff's deputy was working a traffic detail near the University of Cincinnati. The school was holding a commencement ceremony, and the area was filled with pedestrians and event traffic. The deputy, who was a retired officer working in a limited capacity, was stationed in a marked position on Martin Luther King Drive, assisting with crowd control and directing vehicles through the area. At approximately 4 p.m., a vehicle traveling through the area left its lane and struck the deputy at a high rate of speed. The impact was severe, and despite the efforts of the medical personnel at the scene, the deputy died from his injuries. The driver of the vehicle was identified as 38-year-old Rodney Hinton Jr. Rodney was taken into custody, and he was later charged with aggravated murder. Prosecutors alleged that the act was deliberate. They claimed that Rodney targeted the deputy, accelerated toward him intentionally, and struck him with the intent to kill. According to the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office, surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence on the scene support the allegation that the crash was not accidental.
Through the intersection, directly at where Deputy Henderson was standing, struck Deputy Henderson and the metal utility pole on the northeast corner of the intersection.
Okay. Were there any evidence of skid marks?
No, there were no indications at any point that he tried to brake, stop, or otherwise avoid Deputy Henderson.
So at his arraignment, Rodney was, of course, denied bond. The court, cited the seriousness of the offense and the nature of the evidence presented by the prosecution, which I imagine was the surveillance footage that they mentioned. Rodney's defense attorney didn't contest the denial of a bond, but he did indicate that they would be reviewing all the available footage and reports from both incidents, the shooting of Ryan Hinton and the death of the deputy, as part of their investigation.
I think the conduct in question is classic mental illness criminal conduct. It's always intentional, it's bold, it's conspicuous.
I don't know that...
That's a hallmark sign that somebody is not in their right frame of mind, no attempt to deceive, no attempt to hide what they did.
The defense has acknowledged the emotional toll of the events and noted that Rodney had no prior felony record. Deputy Larry Ray Henderson Jr., who was the individual who was struck by Rodney, had previously retired from full-time law enforcement and had been working part-time assignments on behalf of the sheriff's office. He had been assigned to the commencement ceremony for traffic management, and he was wearing a uniform at the time of the incident. A funeral service was scheduled by the sheriff's department with full honors, and the agency released a statement describing his service as honorable and his death as a great loss to the community. These events unfolded over the course of roughly 30 hours. First, a police shooting involving a teenager, then a viewing of the footage by the victim's father, and then finally, of course, a vehicular incident resulting in the death of a member of law enforcement. Police have stated that there is no evidence linking the deputy who was struck to the shooting of Ryan. The Cincinnati Police Department and the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office operate separately, and the deputy that was struck was not involved in the East Prince Hill incident whatsoever. But of course, prosecutors maintain that the timing and circumstances of the crash point to an intentional act. Investigators are, of course, continuing to gather surveillance footage from nearby businesses and interviewing witnesses who saw what happened, but both of these incidents are still under investigation. Currently, Rodney Hinton Jr. remains in custody at the Hamilton County Justice Center, facing 1 count of aggravated murder. His next court appearance has been scheduled, and prosecutors indicate that they will pursue the case to the fullest extent under Ohio law. As for some takeaways from this story, what happened here wasn't just a tragedy. It was more like a chain reaction. One event touched off another in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like structural failure. When Ryan was shot and killed by the police, the story didn't end at the scene. It kept going. It carried over into the life of his father, Rodney, and set off what prosecutors are now calling a deliberate act of murder, and it very well may be. But behind this legal framing is something deeper, and that is the way that institutions collide with personal trauma. Rodney didn't just lose his son, he was shown the state's official version of why. And less than a day later, someone else was dead. Whether or not Rodney acted with intent, what's clear is that unchecked trauma under institutional pressure has the power to create a ripple effect far beyond the original act. When systems are built to manage force but not the aftermath, they don't prevent violence, they just delay it or transform it into some other thing. And there's also a difference between justice and closure. And Rodney didn't get either of those things. Watching the footage of his son's death wasn't about answers, it was about control. It was the state's way of saying, here's what happened, and that's the end of it. But for a grieving father, especially one who might have believed that his son was gunned down unnecessarily, the footage probably wasn't a resolution. It was more like fuel. And grief doesn't always follow due process. It doesn't stop at legal definitions. It festers when people feel powerless, when they feel like the system closed the case before it was ever even open. And that doesn't excuse what happened next, but it helps explain how easily emotion can override reason when the only thing that you have left is anger. We talk a lot about transparency in policing, but what good is transparency if it only shows you the things you can't change? We should also talk about the contrast between public narratives and the personal experiences of people, specifically Rodney. So the official line was immediate. Rodney accelerated his car. It was deliberate, premeditated, retaliatory. The narrative is locked in before anyone even asks why. And that's not new. Police departments know how to shape a story. But in this case, there's a disconnect between the legal version of events and the personal reality of a man who had just lost his child. The state had already killed his son, and the people watching from the outside were never meant to see anything but a clean-cut story. One bad guy, one hero in uniform, no ambiguity, and no contradictions. But the truth is that when trauma intersects with power, the reality is almost never simple. And when the state gets to define both sides of the story, the public never sees the version that actually bleeds. There's also something unsettling about how quickly all of this happened. One day, a young man is shot by police. The next day, a deputy is dead in the street. Both events, of course, are being framed as individual tragedies, but they're really not. They're symptoms of the same disease. When communities don't trust that the system will hold itself accountable, people don't just grieve, they spiral. They take justice into their own hands and they lash out. And it's easy to say that that's wrong, and it is, but it's harder to ask what drove them to that point. We like to pretend that violence begins and ends with the individual, but it doesn't. Like I said, it festers in the vacuum, left behind when the system refuses to change. And this isn't about justifying violence. It's about recognizing that when accountability fails, it doesn't just erode trust, it invites chaos. The decision to show Rodney the body cam footage of his son's death just a day after the shooting wasn't a neutral act, in my opinion. That's a strategic choice by the department. And in law enforcement circles, it usually means one thing: the footage aligns with the official narrative, and they want to get ahead of any public backlash before it grows out of control. It's a kind of institutional confidence, but also a subtle form of control. I mean, think about the timeline. Ryan's killed on May 1st. On May 2nd, Rodney is already sitting across from the same department that just took his son's life, being walked through their version of what happened. He's not watching it on his own terms. He's being shown it, filtered through their lens, inside their building, with their people controlling the pace, the commentary, the context. That's not transparency, that is containment. And it's just psychologically volatile. Most people don't process death in 24 hours, let alone violent death. I mean, you're still in shock, you're in denial, and then suddenly you're watching your kid collapse on video, possibly in a way that contradicts your own sense of what really happened. Maybe you don't see a threat. Maybe you see panic. Maybe you see fear, but you don't get to argue about it. You're a guest in the very place responsible for pulling the trigger. That moment becomes a kind of soft closure imposed by force. The footage is supposed to explain things, but in reality, all it does is solidify the state's version of events. There's no counselor in the room, no neutral third party, just the weight of the institution and a grieving parent being expected to absorb it like a press release. And in Rodney's case, he didn't absorb it. He left. And hours later, an innocent man was dead. So, whose fault is that? Now, I'm not saying the footage made him kill someone, but when people are under intense emotional distress, timing is everything. That viewing wasn't therapy, it was a controlled burn. And someone, somewhere in that department, should have known that giving a grieving father a trauma bomb without any plan to manage the fallout was just asking for something to go wrong.
As the chief for the city of Cincinnati and this police department, my commitment is to transparency. I have nothing to hide. I will share whatever I can share throughout this process.
Even if it's not favorable for the police, you will share.
Yeah, I will always share what information, what factual information I have. I think like any family member, they were all distraught over what they just saw.
Did he get up abruptly and just walk out of the room, or did he?
He did leave the room, yes.
All of a sudden, he left the room.
Yeah,
okay.
he walked out.
This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a systemic failure wrapped in 2 days of preventable chaos. Ryan's death was the spark, but everything that followed was built on institutional indifference, emotional negligence, and just a total lack of foresight from the people in power. Rodney was basically handed a live wire, the footage of his son being killed, without any kind of emotional buffer, no mental health support, no space to process. The police department moved fast, not to offer compassion, but to get ahead of the narrative. And they did what departments always do: close ranks, justify the shooting, sanitize the story. When Rodney broke under the pressure, they were ready with a new headline: premeditated, calculated, case closed. What this whole chain of events shows is that the system knows how to protect itself, but it has no idea what to do with human grief. It treats trauma like a PR problem and outrage like a threat. There's no safety valve here, no de-escalation, no humanity, just 2 lives lost and a third one locked up, all in under 48 hours. This isn't just about what happened, it's about the institution that wasn't there to stop it. All right, that's all I got for you today, guys. I know I went on quite a rant there, but let me know how you feel about the format of this kind of video in the comments below. I appreciate you taking your time to be here. It would mean the world to me if you could take a second to subscribe so we could get to 100K. We're Very close. And also, if you're interested, don't forget to pick up your copy of this Civilian Rights Hand Guide in the link below. That's it for today, folks. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.